center, and Oran will be talking about the mathematical objection to artificial machine intelligence. Please join us for Oran's talk. If you want to talk to Oran, you should do it very quickly because Oran has to leave the center very soon to go back to Israel to be the head of Hebrew University. It's now or never if you want to have a chat with the man. On Friday, my colleague Amanda Evans will be talking about psychiatric deep brain stimulation and the ethics of mechanistic recovery. And on Tuesday next week, Margaret Farrell, a postdoc at the center, will be talking about what would imaginary ancestors do. Imaginary things, the answer. In any case, today it's my great pleasure to introduce Angela Potochnik, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Cincinnati. She's also the head of the Department of Philosophy there, and she's also the founding director, and she's still the director of the Center for Public Engagement with Science. That's a lot of hats to wear on one head, and she nonetheless has managed to publish 4 books in recent years. That just gives you a sense of her skills and capacities and talent. The first book is actually not even, has she published 4 books. The first book has become a classic in philosophy of science, Idealization and the Aims of Science, published in 2017, that many of us, pretty much I would say all of us in this room have at least read in part, and many of us entirely. Which is about the role of modeling and explanation in science. We have extremely influential, cited hundreds of times already. It has been followed by a book, Recipes for Science, an Introduction to Scientific Methods and Reasoning in 2018, with a recent edition in 2024, which is a bit of a textbook, and as I understand, in part for scientists as well, or just for philosophers. About how to reason scientifically well. She also has published 2 elements in connection with her job as director of the center. So 2 elements about the relation between the science and the public. The first one is called Science and the Public in 2024. And the second one with Melissa Jacquard was called Public Engagement with Science, Defining the Project in 2025. So that's 4 books. Despite all this additional work, she has published in all the journals in philosophy and philosophy of science, including also in scientific journals, the American Scientific, Physics Today, Trends in Ecology and Evolution, and so on, and so forth. She's also the PI of an NSF grant, and sometimes she sleeps, I'm sure. So anyway, we are very happy to have her today at the center and to be able to listen to her more recent thoughts. The topic today will be causes, not causes.
Thank you. Thanks, Edward, for the incredibly kind introduction. And thanks, everybody, for showing up this afternoon. And thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Wonderful place to visit. OK, so I mentioned to the graduate students that I had lunch with that I'm trying to get better at not giving disclaimers at the beginning of talks, but I still fail every time. My disclaimer today is, this is a big picture talk, and this is a new talk. So I welcome suggestions on how to refine the ideas, and I hope to convince you that it's both at the same time not an obvious thing that all of us already believe, and also not completely wrong-headed. Those are my goals today. OK, so the starting point for this talk is the range of features that define complex systems. Complex systems research has shown that systems of different types and at different scales can exhibit similar features, right? Scale-free behavior. These include robust behavioral regularities that can be described without referencing system specifics, variability in how systems accomplish these same regularities, and then interdependence among system elements. We see, I guess I referenced this a second ago, but we see scale-free patterns. So I guess this is like my, it's been too long since I've thought about this. So I have a small world network at the top of my slide. We see nonlinear interactions, a great sort of simple example of which is the Lotka-Volterra predator-prey relationships. And then systems, all systems are open, But increasingly, some systems are being treated as open systems where the boundary between what the system is and what the environment is to some extent accepted to be a matter of convention. All right, so I take it that these are all sort of, there's a quick gesture in the direction of a lot of different ideas and to some extent implicitly a lot of different methods involved in complex systems research. Complex systems approaches are a particular style of doing science. It's just one way of doing science. It's not the only way to do science. But we have seen significant advances in complex systems research in past decades. And their widespread value, I think, tells us something about how the world is. Namely, it's complex. Even when complex systems approaches aren't employed or aren't needed for some problem, study of other aspects of related phenomena can warrant these techniques. The conclusion I want to draw, at least, from the widespread value of complex systems approaches is that our world can sometimes be successfully studied as if it's simple, but it is fundamentally complex. Like I said, this is a starting point for my talk. In this talk, I want to explore implications that I think these developments have for our very concept of causation. Specifically, I'm going to conjecture that the model of causation as isolated direct influence, like billiard balls, is deeply misleading. I also, in passing, will have to convince you that we do have this assumption that causation is like billiard balls. Instead of billiard ball causation, consideration of the uses and limitations of basic scientific techniques supports, I think, a different concept of causation, what we might think of as a causal mesh. Maybe there's a better metaphor, maybe there's a better name. Right now I have causal mesh. So the name might be a metaphor, mesh might be a metaphor here, but I want to emphasize that I think this point is not just a matter of metaphor, of what metaphor we use for causal relations in the world. I intend this as a claim about the fundamental nature of causation, whatever that means, about how causation occurs, and thus, in some sense, about what causation really is. I think the persistence of the concept of causation as pushing obscures the expansiveness of causal relevance, and as a result, is virtually inapplicable to the complex systems that comprise our world. So I'll end the talk by exploring what I take to be I'll gesture in the direction of what I take to be some philosophical implications that I think this kind of reframing might have. So that's the plan. To get started, like I said, I have to tell you what I mean by billiard ball causation and try to convince you that such a commitment, in fact, does exist. So here's maybe a quick, basic definition of what I mean by billiard ball causation, what I have in mind here. Just the idea that causal influence, in some way, reduces to isolated direct influence. That isolated direct influence is in one way or another basic for causal relationships. This is, I think, interpreting causation as change. Sorry, thinking about my notes are not what I expect here. For billiard ball causation, let's think of this as the idea that either causation fundamentally is, or at least can successfully be treated as if it is, introduced change, a movement or shift from one point of stasis to a new point of stasis, and a kind of discrete influence, right? So this I take it as kind of the basic components of what it is to hit one billiard ball with a cue stick and have it collide with another billiard ball. And I think that broadly, I'll say more about this in a second, I think that broadly, a lot of scientific and philosophical commitment suggests that either causation fundamentally is taken to be billiard ball causation, or at least, like I said, sort of can be treated as if it follows this model. So introduce change, movement from one point of stasis to another point of stasis, and a kind of discrete influence. The association of causation with pushing was inherited, I think, I don't know any history before 20th century, but I think was inherited from the mechanistic philosophy that reigned in Newton's day, and is reinforced by contemporary science's experimental practices and causal modeling techniques. So first of all, let's start here. This is sort of the easiest place to start in motivating the idea that we all, scientists and philosophers, on some level commit to this kind of a view of causation. First, consider the literal use of billiard balls as a model in physics and the assumptions that this introduces. So both the image in passing, both the image on this slide, right, comes from like an intro physicsy treatment of collisions. And the literal picture was striking me, the literal picture of billiard balls from the last slide actually came from a physics source as well. I just Googled billiard balls and went to images, and physics sources came up at the top, which I thought was kind of interesting. Okay, so considering the literal use of billiard balls as a model in physics, this introduces the assumptions, when we're dealing with billiard ball models in physics, that the parties to the causal interaction are rigid spheres, that it's a simple linear system, that there is an introduction of an external force, and observation of the system until it is motionless. So this conforms pretty directly to what I suggested on the last slide as billiard ball causation. Thinking beyond that, right, there's a lot of science that's not a billiard ball model used in physics, a whole bunch of science. So looking beyond that in a much less literal way, I think something akin to this applies in other parts of science as well. The assumption of linear systems, the application of an external force, continuation until stability. All of this, I think, is incorporated into experimental practices much more broadly in science. We see this with experimental practices that prioritize, for obvious reasons. I'm not saying these are the wrong practices, to be clear, but experimental practices that prioritize intervening on a single causal variable, isolating a direct influence, trying to keep other variables constant or varying separately. Sorry, went all the way back. I didn't want you to do that. This sense of billiard ball causation, I think, is implied by an experimental focus on intervening on a single causal variable and controlling other variables to identify isolated direct influence. Trying to identify experimental practices ultimately, I think, are attempts to identify billiard ball-like causal relationships, which we all know aren't, precisely just that, right? Lots of work goes into developing an experimental system such that causal relationships are approximately billiard-like, but a lot of experimental work is put into identifying billiard ball-like causal relationships across systems of interest. I think that some of the same influence, sorry, the word's not doing what I think it should, influence causal modeling techniques as well. So causal modeling techniques employ something like these same assumptions in the background. These are revealed by the standard assumptions, I think, of modularity, quite broad assumption in causal modeling, as well as the causal Markov condition. Like experiments, causal models aim, I think, to identify isolated direct influence. So this is meant to convince you, like I said, that experimental scientific practices broadly, experimental and modeling alike, build into the way in which causation is treated a basicness to a kind of billiard ball causation. The hope of reducing causal relationships out in the world into billiard ball relationships. The focus, I think, is also shared by philosophical accounts of causation. So starting with physical accounts of causation, these focus variously on marked transmission, the exchange of conserved quantities, and causal processes. Such conceptions of causation apply nicely, I think, to billiard ball causation. Applying these conceptions, these various physical accounts of causation that I just briefly named, to other varieties of causal relationships, like causal interactions and feedback loops, involves treating those causal relationships as if they are built up from billiard ball causation. I think this sort of reveals a kind of treating as basic billiard ball causation. Physical accounts of causation thus attempt to extrapolate from a specific variety of causation, billiard ball causation, to all causation. Manipulability accounts of causation, in turn, most fully and influentially, of course, developed by Jim Woodward, assumes billiard ball causation in its own ways. This account of causation is closely aligned, of course, with causal modeling techniques, as I talked about on my last slide. The manipulability account focuses on discrete relationships between a limited set of variables, And when we look at, right, the relation of intervention between just two variables, and the analysis relies on holding background conditions stable to define causal relationships. This, illustrated by these scientific and philosophical commitments, is what I mean by billiard ball causation. A two-part causal relationship, or causal process, is taken to be, in some sense, the basic type of causation from which all causal relationships arise. Or more modestly, as I've said, perhaps it's just that all causal relationships can somehow, one way or another, mostly, be treated as if they are built up from this basic type of causation. Quick side note in passing, in the past, I've articulated the idea, in my idealization book, I've articulated the idea of causal complexity in these very terms by appealing to causal steps further back in time and causal influences spreading further out at any given point in time. Sort of what I'm going through with this talk really is sort of questioning for myself whether that's just fundamentally the wrong way to think about causation. Okay. Now's the part when I try to convince you that a commitment to a billiard ball causation is a mistake and that there is an alternative. There's another way of conceiving of causation that might work better. The basic move that I have in mind is similar, analogous, I think, to the view that Nancy Cartwright introduces about laws in her classic book, How Laws of Physics Lie. The laws of physics are generally taken to hold strictly in rarefied conditions, but to apply imperfectly to the whole world on that basis. Cartwright argues instead in this book that these laws are simply false of all but the rarefied conditions of the lab. Part of the argument, I take it, is that there's no sound reason to think the complexity of the everyday is in any sense built out of the simple law-like relationships that obtain in the lab. So my suggestion here, I think, is analogous. Maybe it's more deeply related than analogy, I don't know, but I at least think it's analogous. Just like our complex world is not built out of simple law-like relationships that obtain in the lab, complex causation, I think, is not built out of billiard ball causation. This idea is supported by the breakdown of the core features that I've identified with billiard ball causation. First of all, the difficulty of direct variable control and the proliferation of interacting background conditions. These points are rather obvious, as many of our scientific techniques in experimentation, observational studies, and modeling, as I already mentioned, are designed to overcome this very challenge. We all know that direct variable control is hard and that there are lots of different background conditions. That's not sort of a novel idea. But I suggest these are reasons to start to pause and question the move that we might be inclined to make conceptually, that complex causation in some way is built out of simple causal relationships. Another challenge identified especially for a manipulability approach to causation, I think, or has been identified especially for a manipulability approach to causation, large part by Sandy, is the failure of modularity, causal modularity. That is, briefly, the widespread inability to hold background conditions fixed when an intervention is performed. Yes, I'm not going to try to do a better job of describing it or say more about it. I'm going to move on. I take it that the failure of modularity is some sign that we don't have a simple building up of causal complexity out of basic billiard ball relationships of causation. More challenging still, I gather it's rather commonly accepted now by the parties to the debate that whether there's a causal or manipulability relationship is actually relative to variable selection, to what variables are in the causal model. That factor, right, which variables have been selected to include in the causal model influences whether in fact there is a causal relationship between two variables. I take this to be a rather troubling consequence for anything like a billiard ball conception of causation. The basic fact of whether a causal relationship obtains between two variables, I gather, on a manipulability approach, depends not just on what the background conditions are, what the values are of other variables, but on a representational choice of the modelers regarding what variables to include in the model. Indeed, my claim about billiard ball causation might go beyond Cartwright's negative claim about scientific laws. So I'm not just saying maybe that you can't, that there's no reason to presume that all of causation reduces to billiard ball causation. For the reasons I've identified here, I want to say that beyond this, not only do we not have good reason to presume complex causation is built out of billiard ball causation, but also complex causation, in some cases, can't even be successfully treated as if it's built out of billiard ball causation. It's a different creature. Sometimes we can pretend it's billiard balls. In some cases, we just can't. Okay, so what's causation instead if it's not a two-part relationship between billiard balls? In brief, I think it's a mesh. And again, if there's a better word, tell me what it is. I've gone around a little bit about that. What I mean by that is that causation in its basic form, basic causation, is not a two-part relation, but expansive, multidirectional, maybe all directional, omnidirectional. It's not linear relationships, but again, at its base, nonlinear relationships. Not separate relations, but rather interactions. And not isolated forces. These are a little bit clunky how I phrase them here, I think. Not isolated forces, but equilibria. Sort of, systems in change or points between change if we have temporary equilibria. So the view I'm proposing in this talk is that this simply is what causation is. Like I said, kind of at its basic, at its most basic. I thus think that billiard ball causation, as I've represented it, is wrong. Nor can causation generally be adequately treated as if it is billiard ball causation. When causation looks like billiard ball causation, as it does sometimes in the most successful laboratory experiments or causal models, this is only because of really odd conditions obtaining temporarily in just a tiny part of what is always an expansive causal mesh. Okay, billiard ball causation. Briefly, why I think it's a conception that is at sort of some level of forward or in behind our philosophical and scientific practices is a commitment that we generally hold. And then briefly, the introduction of what I think might be an alternative to a commitment to billiard ball causation. My last set of points, my last job, I take it, is to try to convince you that these ideas make some difference to science and philosophy of science, that something will change, that if I convince you or one scientist or another to think about causation in terms of mesh, that this will make a difference for something, that it's not just a choice of metaphor for causation. I want to suggest that some philosophical gains do follow directly from taking on a causal mesh conception of causation. Namely, by not treating billiard balls or relationships between isolated variables as the basic form of causation, we see that causal interaction, equilibria, and complex systems are standard fare. This dissolves some questions, I think, about how these sort of puzzles relate to causation. Yeah, I think I'll say a little bit more later when I get, yes, I'll say a little bit more later about why I think that I should, that this comes out of taking seriously a causal mesh conception of causation. I'm just sort of claiming it at this point, I suppose. I also think that this might have implications for both physical and manipulability approaches to causation or accounts of causation. For physical causation, perhaps this aligns with the challenge of field theories for conserved quantities accounts. There's a question mark up here because this is beyond things that I know. So I'm introducing the question. This might have, this sort of concern or motivation of alternative view might align with this challenge for conserved quantities accounts of causation. In any case, this does decenter, I think, discrete causal relationships or causal processes in favor of causal interaction. I mentioned that I think this has implications for a manipulability approach to causation as well. Namely, I think that it follows from this that we should accept straightforwardly the failure of modularity, that sort of causal relationships being modular is a special case rather than something we should presume of systems. And I think, as I understand things, I think Jim has moved in this direction in his writing over the years. And also, I think that this can account for why there is this failure of modularity, as well as the relativity of manipulability relationships to choice of causal variables. I think that makes this a causal mesh conception, I think, makes that relativity less mysterious. Yes. Beyond this, I think that a causal mesh conception also makes clear, and this is maybe we're moving towards scientific implications with this, but I take it that a causal mesh conception and sort of embracing the kind of relativity of talking about a discrete causal relationship between two variables and how that inevitably, almost inevitably, depends on variables and the treatment of variables surrounding them. I think this makes clear something that I believe independently, that it's essential to theorize the choice of causal variables, that this isn't some sort of initial step that can be taken for granted as part of scientific research, but needs to be attended to. Why are we investigating causal relationships between these variables? Why are these other variables in the model or not? I think that there might be some additional philosophical gains that I think of as implications for scientific practice. First of all, I take it that this reframing of the nature of causation can help us recognize the idealizations that are always involved in controlled experiments and causal models. I think Emily Park's work on the similarities between experiments and models sort of pushes in this direction. This also, I think, maybe entails is too strong, but suggests that we should take quite seriously the complex systems approaches that motivated my talk at the beginning. There is, I think, additional motivation to look for applications, new applications of complex systems approaches. And importantly, maybe most importantly for philosophers, but scientists need, I think, to hear this lesson as well, to treat complex systems approaches as just as legitimate as other approaches, and maybe, right, if we fully take on board this causal mesh conception, in some sense more right of the world, rather than treating complex systems approaches, as I think sometimes happens, as kind of a fallback move when we can't do better, or at least as not sufficiently revealing about the nature of systems. Finally, this conception of causation could, I think, and should provide philosophical considerations influencing how science is conducted. In particular, that scientific research should, more than it does at present, seek large-scale, distant, and structural influences. So this would follow from fully taking on board the idea that there is a pervasive causal mesh, that there's no way in which the small scale, the nearby, and the immediate acting is sort of more robustly causal than any other influences in our world. Recognizing the fundamental existence of a causal mesh, I think, should remove any prioritization of the small, the local, and the direct influences. Causation isn't built out from billiard balls, so any variety of causal influence at any scale and distance may turn out to be important. So I want to finish by thinking about that idea, spending a little bit more time on that idea. And like I said, I think it'll help to get back to this point that I made in passing about structure and equilibrium on a past slide as well. I haven't said yet what I mean by focusing on structural influences. I haven't defined structural. I won't actually either. But I'll do a little bit more to motivate it. And so I want to conclude and do that by talking about my garden, specifically my garden in 2023. Check my notes. Yes, I do not want to talk about my garden this year. Do not ask me. No discussion of this year's garden. Many authors have invoked structure in discussions of equilibrium explanation, other contexts as well. Though often this has been intended, this invocation in equilibrium explanation has been intended to contrast structure with causes. So here is Elliot Sober in his classic paper on equilibrium explanation. He says, the causal explanation focuses exclusively on the actual trajectory of the population. In contrast to that causal explanation, right, focusing on the trajectory, the equilibrium explanation situates the actual trajectory, whatever it may have been, in a more encompassing structure. It is in this way that equilibrium explanations can be more explanatory than causal explanations, even though they provide less information about what the actual cause was. So I agree, and I hope it's clear. I'm not going to sort of do much to position the view that I've tried to sketch here with this quote from Sober, but I hope it's clear from what I've said. I agree that he is right, except the opposition with these powerful equilibrium explanations for what is truly causal, which would be charting, right, the causal trajectory. I think there's good reason to think that all of this is causal. Some more recent work has challenged this distancing between structural explanation from causation. Of course, you see the alternative work in recent work as well, but a sort of selective attention towards the authors that I think are moving towards seeing structural as causal. Emily Sullivan in 2019 has argued that renormalization group explanations should be seen as properly causal in nature. Renormalization group explanations, of course, have been sort of a favorite example of a certain variety of non-causal explanation advocate. And then Lauren Ross has argued more recently that social structural explanations also should be interpreted as a variety of causal explanation. So I think both Sullivan and Ross are correct on this. And I think the point is much broader. I think we could continue to do this with other varieties of structural explanation that at first glance don't look to be properly causal because they don't feature billiard balls. Structural influences, I think, regularly shape the goings-on in our world. And recognizing the continuity of these influences with local causal influence, I think, is just the best way to accommodate this observation. All right, so Garden in 2023. A beginner's view of Garden may simply be, I mean, it's billiard ball causation. A beginner's view of Garden is that what I have a particular friend who I have in mind as I think through this. What I do if I don't know gardening is I buy packets of seeds for the things I want to have. I find dirt and I stick the seeds in the dirt. Maybe I read the instructions so I know how deep to put them. Then I water them, right? Done. Planting seeds, which is intended to bring about various crops. Of course, we all know that we're not actually done at that point. Also relevant, just at the start, are the background variables of water, quality of soil, growth limitation, right? So we weed in part because of this discouraging animal life and various other kinds of life that would negatively interfere with our crops, but also because of the growth limitation of competing crops or competing plants next to the plants that we're trying to cultivate. And much more beyond this, right? Gardens are clearly complex systems. Gardens aren't fancy. I have one in my backyard, but they're complex systems. Causal interactions are crucial. Examples are easy here. I'm not good at examples. I'll give you a couple of quick ones. Root systems, of course, create positive feedback for water retention. This is why if you water just soil or just soil adjacent to something actually growing, it doesn't do that well. Whereas if you have rich root growth, the soil itself retains the water better to then feed the roots that you're trying to cultivate in the soil. Of course, we can introduce various kinds of organisms on and near plants to discourage or encourage other sorts of organisms living nearby as well. So gardens are complex systems. And mastery of gardening in large part involves monitoring an ever greater number of structural influences, not doing more, right? But knowing more about the complex system and sort of appreciating how the complex system extends in various ways beyond the, like, in my case, tiny, tiny patch of garden that you have. Knowing when and learning through experience, when and how you actually do need to intervene on the structure and sort of shift the complex causal interactions that are occurring. It's not that nothing is, of course, I mean, this is an obvious thing to say, but again, just kind of trying to get us to identify and identify how we might be assuming causation works and reframe it, it's not pushing things along in the garden, right? It's a system that is unfolding, and it's sort of shifting how the feedback loops are interacting with one another in this complex system, I take it. Okay, the recognition that causes don't push, but participate in a broad causal mesh, I think paves the way for recognition of a wide range of structural, stable, and background features of the world in a way that I can illustrate just with my garden. I don't think my garden is special in that, other than we kind of know enough about gardens that we can all talk about it. Such structural, distant, background dependencies tend, in many cases, to be easier to ignore. They're less visible or less anticipated due to the scale of influence, due to researchers' implicit expectations, because they think causes are like billiard balls, because they've in some cases been taught causes are like billiard balls, and for more reasons. Still, I think if we accept a causal mesh conception of causation, it clarifies that structural dependencies are not in any sense it depends. It all depends on how the causal action occurs. There's no reason to anticipate on the front end that structural dependencies are objectively less significant than immediate causes. Indeed, because of the nature of complex causation, because of the causal mesh, in many cases, structural dependencies are more powerful. As gardeners and social scientists at least know, structural causes can be more important than triggering causes, than direct causes. The lesson of the equilibrium explanation, I think, is ultimately a lesson about attention. Scientists should look beyond magic bullet explanations that are really tempting to look for, to instead seek structural influences, broad dependencies, stable background conditions, and more. That's what that part is in my picture. So here's a quick example from Ed Yong's tremendous science reporting through COVID-19. The graduate students who went to lunch with me already know that I drove here this morning because Ed Yong gave a talk at Cincinnati last night, and I was like, I can't miss that. So anyway, I drove over here this morning instead of yesterday in order to hear him. He was not talking about COVID-19. He was talking about his book, Immense World, about animal sensation. Going back to his COVID reporting, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize, Yong did a beautiful job of arguing how the germ theory of disease, right? This is the ubiquitous picture that was in so much science reporting through at least like the early stages, maybe the first year of COVID-19 reporting. Yong, I think, did a beautiful job of arguing how the germ theory of disease was in some ways historically adopted as a convenience, because this enabled neglect of something a lot thornier, the social determinants of disease, more difficult to influence, more difficult to figure out how to address, even if we could figure out what would help. But Yong suggested that the progression of the pandemic should, and perhaps could, be a wake-up call, bringing at least the field of public health to consider the broader constellation of factors that shape health outcomes, including susceptibility to and progression of pathogen-borne illnesses. So as research has demonstrated for COVID-19, such factors include a variety of other health conditions, physical living conditions, line of work, access to medical care, and of course, much more. The list continues. Thank you. That was abrupt. Sorry for my abrupt end.
Thank you, Angela, for that talk. I had a question for you to say more about, and that this idea of a mesh seems to me to refer to relationships among things, something.
Okay.
And I don't know what those things are that are to stand in relationship that you describe as a mesh, maybe like billiard ball things. I mean, I'm not clear what this relationship is the relata are.
Yeah.
You could say something.
Okay. So there are at least two things I want to say about that. One is, this is one reason that maybe mesh is the wrong word, because it does suggest this kind of discreteness to what relates that I don't want to that I don't welcome as a suggestion about the metaphor of mesh there. I mean, it's fair, of course, and I'll try to answer it the best I can. It's fair to ask what the relata for causal relations would be on this view. But as I suggested with this kind of picture of causal interaction and causal connection as the default, I do wonder, I'm playing with the idea of whether causation isn't so pervasive that there's something kind of odd about imagining it as little lines connecting lots of little discrete relata, something like that. So on this view, what, to answer your question, or to try to answer your question, what do I think the relata of causal relationships are? I don't.
Because you think that's what causality is about a match.
Right. So what are the relata in that? Okay, good. I mean, I guess I don't really know the answer to that. I think that there's a lot about this isn't. Hopefully, it was clear. This isn't right a comprehensive account of the nature of causation. There's a lot about, as I sort of gesture along the way about physical accounts of causation manipulability. There's a lot that I am, candidly not qualified to say about the metaphysics of causation. I think what I would want to say is that we can probably talk about causal relata, the nature of relata, in the ways that we philosophers and scientists, both included, are accustomed to, with the possible exception that because of this kind of, because of the point about the causal mesh and what I just tried to clarify about, I don't have in mind sort of little dots that then have lines between them or anything like that. So causal relata can be whatever we think causal relata are in general, except also I think we should take seriously the ways in which we can variously carve up, well, it's hard to do this in the abstract, variously carve up what can be causally related, right? So if I retreat to like a manipulability position as a way to try to make this point, this is what I have in mind for this last bit is just that specifically how we characterize causal variables is really important, and causal variables can be defined in lots of different ways. We don't sort of, the world around us doesn't hand us what the variables are. I don't know if that helps.
I'd like to go back to your garden.
Yes.
Which I think refutes your story.
Oh no.
I think it's self-refuting.
Oh no. Here's my garden.
How you describe it.
Yes.
You buy the seeds, you put the seeds in the soil, and we all know that's not sufficient for the plants to grow. Mm-hmm. Indeed, that's no news. We've known that since the Neolithic.
But this is why I like the example. I'm not telling you anything new here. Sure. Yeah.
Every piece of it is something you call billiard ball science. So the seed was selected from generations of seeds. Possibly the DNA was altered. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Experiment by experiment by experiment.
Oh, for sure.
The luminosity. Yeah. We've studied the effects of light on plant growth. Soil. Well, soil has a chemical composition, and boy, did we study that piece by piece, billiard ball by billiard ball.
Absolutely.
So it's a bunch of billiard balls plus what's been known since the Neolithic. So I say self-refute.
Okay, so here's why I think I'm okay still. I at least don't think I've refuted myself. So I absolutely agree with you that experimental and modeling techniques, I mean, maybe it's not an exaggeration to say there's a long list of experimental, observational study and modeling techniques that are successful and crucial because they enable the systems of our world to be treated more as if they consist of billiard ball causes. right? So figuring out how to intervene on an independent variable in an experimental system, figuring out how to indirectly control background variables in a field study or something, all sorts of modeling techniques. I think that I am not questioning the value of doing science that way. So I'm a little bit out there, but like not that out there. Those are really important. Right. Yeah, I'm maybe being long-winded, but I'm getting there. Those are really important techniques. So the point of me describing early on the ways in which these techniques take on, I think, a kind of commitment to billiard ball causation is not to then infer we shouldn't use these techniques, but to move to the limitations, the recognized limitations of all of those techniques of experiments, observational studies, and modeling, and the success of other ways of doing science to suggest that what we're really dealing with can sometimes be idealized to be treated as if they are billiard ball relationships, but to take seriously that that's sort of an important convenience of some scientific practices, not an identification of the way that our world is.
The way we could have done science.
It's not a point of it's not a point of I'm not okay. So I guess I am in one. Okay, sorry, I'm gonna stop interrupting myself. I am not suggesting we should do fewer controlled experiments or only do complex systems research. So at the beginning, I pointed out that we don't always need to do scientists don't always need to use complex systems approaches. But I think there's something enlightening about seeing where those are successful and something enlightening about the general purchase that they have. Experimental techniques, causal models, observational studies, yes, these are all very important. We should not then, I think, take a next step, which I think implicitly a lot of us do, and scientists more maybe even than philosophers of science, to the idea that that's revealing something about how causation works or the fundamental nature of causation.
I know you wanted to put a sorry. Go for it.
I have a question on the relativity, also relationship.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Whether x plus y depends on another variable z. In the sense in which, if it's a common cause that we don't control for, we might be mistaken in thinking that x causes y, when in fact it doesn't. But then there's maybe a stronger sense in which, whether, as a matter of fact, x causes y depends on, in some sense, like other variables. So I'm wondering if you could clarify that.
Yeah. So both, and I think if I understood your second stronger sense, and so this is within a manipulatability approach, am I correct, where you're kind of thinking about? I was especially trying to draw attention to, as I haven't contributed to this discussion, as I understand discussion of a manipulability approach to causation, it has been found that in some systems, which variables you include in the model influences whether you see a manipulability relationship between two other variables that are included, right? So that there's a modeling choice that influences whether, right, by the definition of manipulability, definition of, what is the definition I need? Intervention. Anyway, yeah. There's another bit of the account I feel like I need to reference, but it doesn't matter. But by the definitions invoked in the manipulability account, that you end up with a kind of relativity there that you wouldn't expect. Sorry, that was too wordy. Hi.
I'll leave back at some point and ask a more physicsy question, but I actually want to go back one, yeah, please. To just explore a bit what you took the lesson to be from the sort of comments on that we use in germ theory as a demonstration. Because I mean, there's a sense in which you can call about me. I've read that. I mean, with the pandemic, you could at least make a fairly plausible case that our various complicated holistic social interventions were a bit of a mess. But the one thing that did work really well was mRNA vaccines. And to take it perhaps I mean, I think that example, I think the evidence is reasonably clear, but to take
Okay.
more clear, look at the eradication of smallpox.
Mm-hmm,
Now, it was
yeah,
no doubt true that spread of
that one's very
smallpox
clear.
was influenced by a plethora of socio-causal factors, and from the point of view of just the empirical, the blue sky study of smallpox, one would be having way too oversimplified a view of one only looked at the germ theory. But it was still true that the smallpox virus was a but-for of the spread of smallpox, and by rather narrowly and inductively targeting vaccination of smallpox, it was eliminated.
Yeah,
and at that
absolutely.
Point,
yeah.
From a public policy point of view, all of the sociocultural aspects of smallpox systematic damn viruses. And so I certainly wouldn't take you as thinking that was a bad idea, but I was just trying to understand how to fit that kind of rather more, if you like, magic bullet. Yeah.
I mean, that's a wonderful example of this kind of magic bullet approach being amazingly effective. The reason I was like waffling around COVID-19 and vaccine I was trying on for size isn't because I'm a vaccine skeptic. It's because right now, I don't know whether I'm supposed to get a booster shot this year. I'm confused. I got my flu shot, even though it sure seems like there's not a lot of strong administrative support for what was in my flu. I mean, I think it was safe, but like, was it effective? We'll see. We'll see how good it was. And so I feel like a lot of the messiness that I think you're rightly pointing to about these other kinds of interventions for COVID-19 have ended up being complicating factors for something that might be a magic bullet solution as well. And also the bullet's less magic for COVID-19 and flu than smallpox. Yeah. But even with smallpox, okay, so yes, this is an amazing outcome, and one that I agree fits perfectly with this magic bullet. And sometimes we see things like that. Sometimes the causal structure is that way. It's great to look for that when it is. What is overlooked, just trying this one on for size, because I don't know kind of where smallpox fits well enough to know how well it fits, but what's overlooked even with that success is the extent to which the social determinants of smallpox became the social determinants of other illnesses and entirely other forms of disease that don't relate to illness because of these incredibly, I think what we know through to some extent public health and to some extent sociology, are really essential factors influencing health around access to healthcare, living conditions, all of these really hard to deal with conditions that are probably at least as important to driving an individual's health as is whether they've been vaccinated for, whether the community around them has been vaccinated for smallpox, something like that.
And if I understand correctly, that is causation for complex systems, right? So complex systems are being studied by statistics and network theory, among other things. And so then by analogy, we can say complex causation basically uses statistics and network theory in order to understand causation. And that's what her school and CFU school of causation have been, in my view, all about. So the idea is obviously, in order to characterize a complex system, very hard, but it's non-linearity, we collect various different types of data sets, and then we try to develop various different types of causal search algorithms, etc., in order to understand something about the nonlinear causation in a structured way, in a reliable way. And so then the question is the notion of complex causation that you are promoting another term for the CMU term notion of causation?
Gosh, I don't think it's the same thing, and I'll tell you why I don't think so. I'm trying to suggest that while complex systems approaches are useful for studying certain aspects of certain types of systems, the whole world, causation across the whole world fundamentally is the way that we all appreciate it is in recognized complex systems. And so this gets back a little bit to what Clark was pushing me on. I'm not suggesting that all scientists should be using complex systems approaches all the time, or that causation should always be studied in the way that people working specifically on complex systems as complex systems are doing. But that there is sort of fundamental, there's some broader guidance, I think, for what we philosophers should and shouldn't assert about causation, and how and where scientists should look for causes, that a broader sort of range of conclusions that stem from taking seriously the idea that all systems are fundamentally like that in some way.
So I was thinking about, why do we privilege isolated direct influences? And isolation in particular strikes me as important for separating out genuine causation from spurious correlations. So I was wondering, what's the intellect of that on the causal mesh picture?
Okay, so I have to say that back to you because I don't think I understand yet. Actually, we just try again. Sorry,
Okay, so
I'm almost there, but I don't quite see the.
isolate cause.
Yes, that method. Yeah.
Is largely because we want to make sure that we can pull out spurious.
And find the causes. Yeah.
The billiard ball model does a pretty good job of shielding us against those kinds of errors. I'm not sure what that.
Good. Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. I got it that time through. And yeah, anyway. And so here too, I think I just wanted to distinguish method from inferences we draw from our methods to what causation is. I think that variable control will remain, even if somebody totally goes with me on this, variable control, when possible, remains really important. Treating causation as if it is a discrete relationship between two variables, yeah, I'll just put it that way, is a sort of conceit behind a lot of really essential and successful methods. And I'm not questioning that. I'm just questioning the move from that I think some or many of us slide into, of thinking that has revealed something deep about how causal action occurs. That there's something fundamental about the billiard ball relationships to causal relationships in a way that I think has these kinds of downstream philosophical and scientific implications. So I'm not recommending getting rid of those methods. Okay.
Some systems are not going to behave nicely the way that I just described.
Yeah.
Causal structures.
Yes. Just as causal.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you say, not how do you study the causal relationships in systems in that case, but how do you attribute it?
Yeah, I think it's still a question.
Okay.
Like, there's at least part of it which is like, it's starting to sound like it doesn't actually make a difference in scientific practice. Every time the move is just going to be like, well, whenever we actually have to figure out what a cause is,
Okay.
basically treat it.
Yeah. So I don't think we always have to treat it like a billiard ball model. Yep. Sorry. I don't know if this would be useful, but I thought I'd throw it up here. So I think what I want to say to the question that you first asked is, I don't have anything, at least at this point, unique to say. I want to say ways that scientists are dealing with complex systems, right? And there are a variety of approaches there in that some of which, at least, I think provide causal knowledge at the same depth as more traditional experimental techniques, et cetera. Why I do think, and I think I'm sensitive, I think it's fair to wonder whether this actually has implications for scientific practice. The reason I think that it might, even though I still think our scientists should do experiments, do causal models, et cetera, is that I think that this, I would like for the embrace of this kind of a conception to get scientists to not move directly to judgments about techniques of complex systems, their approaches, for example, as lesser science or something like that, in one case. Also, and maybe more importantly, I think that an implication for scientific practice is this sort of encouragement that all scientists all of the time, maybe that's a slight overstatement, but most scientists most of the time should be looking for the distant, the large scale, the structural. That just as, I do think that as an enterprise, science has been too reductive and sort of focused on the local, the small scale, and the immediate pushing. And so maybe that's what I think is the biggest sort of actual recommendation for scientific practice. Thanks.
Thank you. I had a different reaction to lots of people who asked you questions, especially maybe Takram and maybe David as well. My reaction was, yeah, this seems to be like not too radical, because maybe it's just because my eyes don't see billiard balls and see meshes all around. But I mean, just think about if you're to like expand our scope, what is like W.B. like Du Bois doing when he says that at the turn of the 19th century, why is it that in a certain district in Philadelphia, what's the causes of the Black population being marginalized? Or why, when Kenneth Pomeranz, the historian, says what's the reason, or what are the causes of why Western Europe really kind of pushed ahead China during the Industrial Revolution? Or, I mean, if you kind of expand our scope and see broadly, yeah, it just doesn't. I mean, I don't think any of these answers that Du Bois give or Pomeranz gives to these questions of causation can have any, like billiard ball. You're kind of talk about the billiard ball framework just doesn't work. You can't give a billiard ball example of why the 1929 Great Depression happened. It's just you have to go through these, like what you were saying, like mesh, like conception of causation. So that's why I was wondering why didn't you, when you were presenting this, kind of try to pick up on these examples, maybe from economics or sociology,
yeah, good.
History.
Thank you. I'm glad that you think it's a little bit intuitive. So I think the direct answer to your question is that I don't have much depth of expertise in social sciences, history, et cetera. I welcome the connection that you've drawn, and that makes sense to me as well. I did like quip, right? Something like, as all gardeners and social scientists know, structure is essential. So I agree that there are certain places in science, and I think tends to be in social science, where it's easier to appreciate, where it's harder to find a billiard ball, right, or a magic bullet, but easier to appreciate kind of the need for structure. And so maybe just to recap a couple of things that occur to me as related to your point. I guess what I'm encouraging us to do here, so I do think that there are places, and social science is a great place to look for them, where this sort of causal mesh, as I'm calling it here, is sort of inarguably in front of us, right? Or you have to appeal to structure. And I want to sort of, I guess in this talk, I'm encouraging us to more thoroughly take on board the lessons from that and see how that applies in all of these other scientific contexts as well. Not necessarily in abandoning methods that attempt to identify discrete causal relationships, but in always asking, what are we leaving out? What are we backgrounding? Is there something that's a more important determiner of what's happening here or more interesting for our purposes that we're not focusing on, something like that.
Yeah, right. That sounds great to me, because I was just thinking that, yeah, I mean, these kind of billiard ball framework of causation, this is just me repeating what you said, doesn't apply to all of science, and if we think that it applies to all of science, we're maybe have a myopic view about what science is. Let's start.
Thanks.
John.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think by now, probably this question might just try to ask it in a different way. You identified two different the characteristics of the causal mesh, not linear. Moving on to one of these, which is not two-part extent, ask you what this means in a way that makes the causal mesh unique, different from the billiard ball. Manipulability theories, for instance, you might also say there's a sense in which those are not two-part, or
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Multi-causality, there's a way in which that can be represented within causal graphs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At
Mm-hmm.
least one couple.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second model is germ theory, which I think is, take it you're using that example because it seems like there's two, it was an isolated relationship, the germ and the disease. But even the germ theorists themselves, the analogy was that the virus or the bacteria is a germ in the same way that a seed and, and they extended the analogy to say, well, just like only seeds can germinate in fertile soil, that explains why only germs, human disease causing germs, affect some people. They
Yeah.
while kind of focusing on one cause, recognize the importance of the background conditions. So within the more so-called billiard ball model, it seems like there's difference so much two-part. So I guess the idea is, question is, what is less two-part about the causal mesh?
Thank you. Yeah, so I agree with everything you said. I think that what I want to emphasize with the expansiveness of the causal mesh, started to say causal relationships, of the causal mesh is that this encourages a starting point of thinking about causal connection in every direction. And as I tried to kind of motivate an answer to Sandy, even sort of not amongst particles, right? In a way that's kind of not discrete influences necessarily at its base. So why I think that is different from the sort of alternatives that you quickly ran through is maybe at the level of kind of presumption or starting point. And so we quite easily, because we all know what each other mean by this, distinguishing causes and background conditions. I want to, and I don't think this will be particularly controversial, but I want to reject the idea that there's some sort of objective distinction there. And I think how you phrase the sort of germ theory of disease, even as there's recognition of there's some context in which that causal relationship between the germ and the eventual illness occurs, right? And that can lead to different outcomes. There's a kind of centering, I think, of the disease-causing agent and a way in which we presume tend to presume that that is sort of the site for intervention, and where the causal oomph is, right? Something similar to this causes background condition distinction in a way that I think should be earned rather than presumed. And so this mirrors also what I briefly pointed at in this passage with Elliot Sober ruminating about how the kind of structure can be in which causation occurs, in his way of thinking, can be more powerful than the causal trajectory itself. And I'm sort of encouraging us to take that seriously as just as causal. That was kind of messy, but that's my attempt to kind of motivate that there's something more there than I agree that this is sort of an idea that can be accommodated, that is not strictly incompatible with any of the kind of approaches to causation or cases that you talked about. But there's a way in which I think there's a kind of stability in how those cases or approaches are represented that encourages us to foreground discrete relationships and background things that I think are just as prima facie just as relevant to foreground until we find out otherwise. I hope that made some sense.
Okay, good. So I think, like John, I'm going to ask a version of the same question. John put it really well, but building off of your discussion with them, let me try this. From what you were just saying in response, John, it sounds like your view of a causal mesh is supposed to be the more general story that's more accurate, and a special sub case of it sometimes is the billiard ball story, because it's not actually in conflict with it. Oh, okay. No, I haven't. Okay, well, good. Then this question might be helpful then to try and actually get clear on the nature of the difference between these two viewpoints. Because I was, let me put it this way, this is the original question. So on the billiard ball view, what we're doing with causal inquiry is we're asking the question, I've found an effect, I want to know the cause. Those are the things in my two-part relation on the billiard ball view. Causal inquiry is asking that question, given an effect, I want to go find the cause. That allows it to be multiple causes, right? But if I have an effect, I want to go find the cause. On the causal mesh view, what's the question we're asking when we're doing causal inquiry?
I think we can still ask, I found the effect, let me investigate whether this is a cause. I want to not say, let me go find the cause, because there's never the cause. That's one difference. I don't think there's ever the cause. Even in literal billiard balls on a billiard table. I think there's always different directions we could look. Okay, so I think that way of conceiving of causal investigation is equally valid with that one adaptation of let's not go look for the cause. And I think that's an important one for this kind of perspective that I'm urging. We're not going to look for the cause. We're going to look for whether something I'm interested in investigating is a cause. We can also compare certain types of variables for the features that their causal relationship to the occurrence of interest could have. So I don't think, the reason I sort of grimaced when you said sometimes it's billiard balls is, I think even in our, I can't remember, even in the eradication of smallpox, our most exciting, clean and beautiful experimental results ever, I don't think we were dealing with billiard ball causation. I think that the scientists in question, or et cetera, were dealing with a causal system and an outcome that enabled a kind of control such that the causal mesh could successfully be treated at that particular moment as if it's billiard balls. Just like a billiard table is really carefully designed so that we can get these discrete relationships. Does that mean that that's the only causal relationship happening there? I want to emphasize no, even for billiard balls on a billiard table, there's the holding up of the table, there's the friction, of course, there's what I ate for breakfast and how it influenced my, perhaps how it influenced my use of the cue stick And I think it goes in every direction. And I think that there are objective facts about whether my breakfast mattered or not, and whether my breakfast mattered as much as the tip of the cue stick, and it didn't almost always. I can come up with some weird causal facts such that it did, but usually it doesn't. So I think those are objective facts, but there are contours in every direction, I'm urging you to think, and we can't know on the front end that what's immediately there or visible or changed right before something else occurred is causally more relevant than any of the things treated as background conditions or that we never even considered whether they're background conditions.
Sure, we can't know that on the front end because we're doing a causal investigation, right? So now I'm like far more confused.
Oh, no.
As to what the distinction really is.
So if we can't know that on the front end, then we need to look. And mostly scientists aren't looking, is part of the point. Mostly we're not thinking expansively, I think, about causal relationships.
You're back on the list. Yeah, great. Mark, go for it. Yeah. Yeah.
Too much of it. So there's two aspects of it. In billiard balls, there is a fairly clear story of causal process going on. That would be happy if the West Center happy. But it's been well known through the history of physics that billiard balls, there's a singularity that has to be gotten around that makes it very hard to apply laws of physics to what happens.
Okay. Yeah, good.
I think that orthodoxy would say now that the first thing is you got to deal with the shock waves that get initiated inside the billiard ball and bounce off the back wall. But then you also need to add some thermodynamics in there because there's some heat loss, which explains why it doesn't fully regain its shape, its original shape. So it's very hard. All those things are very hard. And of course, people, even with computers, it's very hard to model these things. But insofar as I can see, billiard balls are a great example of a complex process.
Good.
So I couldn't follow your talk because you would draw these stereotypes, these contrasts between billiard balls, when anything you were putting on the other side, I can find inside the real classical physics.
Good, yeah, good. So I will say something. I recognize that I'm not supposed to be saying good because you just said that I haven't been making any sense. But let me just try to a little bit motivate it. I mean, you know so much more about physics than I do, obviously, and I'm so happy to hear that it is recognizably complex even in billiard balls. But if this is billiard ball physics, all of what you just described isn't present in this technique, right? And this is seen as something worth doing that is a way of treating as simple.
So-called coefficient of restitution, which is not following Newton's laws. So that you're bringing up Nancy Cartwright.
Well, I didn't understand that part. Sorry. Oh, I see. Interesting. Why? Yeah.
All sorts of proposals. Big dispute about this. The lower diagram is an oblique thing. We need some sort of form factor. So forth, and that takes you to wherever you have to bring in torque. So, but those devices are not at, and it bothered Leibniz. So they knew you had to deal with the compression to have a coherent story. What happens? And that does bring in lots of non-linear, all those factors that you put on the other side of
Okay, great. Okay. Okay. So let me take a step back. Maybe I'm just saying something that we all, and I keep using we, but then I feel like I need to clarify. I mean, philosophers and scientists already accept at some level. If that's the case, I think I would want to I think that there's still a point, because I think that much of I don't know exactly how I want to put this. Much of how we as philosophers talk about causation and how causal relationships are treated in at least parts and important parts of scientific enterprise presume otherwise. So I think at least that there's a tension between this picture, which it sounds like has been well recognized for some time in certain contexts and in certain ways. I think there's a tension between that and certain expectations and some expectations we have about causation and what we find in scientific analyses of causation.
I'm Mario. So I understand your talk more like a conflict of epistemology of causation versus the metaphysics of causation rather than the billiard ball model and the causal mesh.
Okay.
And here's my reason for that. So it seems that there are some billiard ball models in your terminology that are actually helpful because they do help us somehow. But if you have a nice little model where we understand the 3 to 17 variables, we can kind of intervene, and sometimes it works, and that's good. You're not against that.
Yes, exactly.
Tool.
Yeah.
And so we figure, and the good thing about billiard ball models is they're simple to understand. That's nice in a way. But you have now a problem if we say, oh, and this is now a causal relationship because the billiard ball model says so. You say, no, that doesn't work. And what I'm now doing, trying to do is I propose a bridge such that you get from the billiard ball models to the metaphysics of causation, what you call causal mesh. I mean, I agree so far, because if you add variables, it could be that some causal relationships vanish, some new ones show up. They're just different, right? But what if under any apt extension of the variable set, the causal relation persists? Haven't we then, independent of whether there's a complex system or not, haven't we then just causation metaphysically?
Yes, yes, yes. And yes, I'm very comfortable with that. And I'm very comfortable saying there just is causation there, even in the nice model of 3 to 17 variables, without doing that additional work. I think that there is causation there.
Even if it vanishes at the extension of the variables.
Yeah, I think so. As long as other people want to say it's a cause, I think I want to say it's a cause. So I am not trying to get us to be more circumspect in what causal relationships we accept, but rather circumspect in what we infer when we found a causal relationship. And I think that that is best understood as identifying in particular conditions. It's best to anticipate that the story will get more complicated outside of your tidy model of 3 to 17 variables, right? That I think in general, sometimes it won't, but I think in general, it's best to anticipate that there will be, sorry, I've changed my slide again. Hopefully, that there will be other variables that are relevant to the variable relation in question, right? That some of the relationships will be nonlinear, that there won't be the sort of tidy arrows from one variable to another, but causal interactions and how the variables influence the dependent variable, et cetera. Yeah, I hope maybe that clarified a little bit.
Okay, so this might just be repeating asking other questions.
I'm sorry, you all. I feel like I've done something wrong if you all think you're asking the same question over and over. Not at all, I'm sure.
Where you are now versus where I thought you were going in the beginning of the talk.
Okay.
I think you said early on something like the billiard ball model is like virtually inapplicable, right? Like it seemed like you were making a really strong claim about the billiard ball model and the mesh was going to be like an alternative, but now it seems like you kind of eased off from that. Is your like,
I don't, oh, sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish. Sorry.
Questions. It's coming out more that your issue is not like with the billiard ball model, but rather with like overly simplistic use of it, going quickly from like methodological and modeling practices to ontological commitment. Like those are more of the issues and not the billiard ball model itself, because you're kind of accepting, yes, the billiard ball model is helpful and we just need to pay attention to these other factors that are highlighted by like bringing in a mesh idea.
So point number one for my own pride is I don't think I'm shifting positions. I definitely think I need to clarify a lot, as is clear from conversation with you all. But I don't think anything is shifting in my position. What I meant to refer, or this is my best attempt so far anyway, what I meant to refer to as the billiard ball model, or really billiard ball causation that I'm targeting, is the idea that causation fundamentally is or can be successfully treated as if it is introduce change, stasis point to new stasis point, discrete influence. So in contrast with the causal mesh rough picture that I just put up again just before this. So what I am not, but also never intended to say, is we shouldn't do experiments, we shouldn't causal model, we shouldn't do science that way. I think we should continue in part doing science that way. What I do still want to say is that by doing science that way, tremendously successfully over centuries, we have not shown that causation fundamentally is or successfully, or can in general successfully be treated as if it's between, yes, as if it's between a simple picture of billiard balls, not the fully complex picture of billiard balls that we also can introduce, right? As if that causation is not fundamentally and cannot generally be successfully treated as if it is introduce change from stasis point to new stasis point with discrete influence. That we do science better, science is done better if our scientists recognize the causal mesh picture of causation. Even the scientists who are continuing to run, importantly, in continuing to run experiments where we're isolating variables or doing observational studies that use various tricks to try to kind of mirror that, et cetera. So the distinction that I think maybe helps with how I heard you frame things is it's not a point about methods, at least not a negative point about experimental methods and others. It's a point of what philosophically we conclude from the methods. The reason I went like this when I said it's not a point about methods is I have suggested, I want to suggest that there's a way in which complex systems approaches aren't taken seriously and are taken to be kind of a fallback, or by some, right, by people who don't do that kind of science, and are taken to be kind of a fallback option that's not giving you sort of as robust as an analysis as you would have with more traditional approaches that I don't think is fair. Did that help clarify? No.
No.
Okay. Sorry.
Curious how much of the distinction between what you're calling billiard ball causation and mesh, or complex mesh causation can be just like terminologically mapped over to just the distinction between causation talk and something like dynamics talk. The reason that this has popped up for me is I'm just noticing the things that you're drawing issue with on the billiard ball side of the story, like isolated direct influence, seems to be pretty integral to the concept of causation. I mean, I think the linearity is not, you know, you can make a causal graph of non-linear relationships and all a lot of those other things are kind of fungible, but the being able to isolate, these are the causes of these effects, and here's the functional relationship between them, how it would have been different. That just seems really integral to causation talk in general. When you start talking about the mesh and how, you know, things can't really be stably isolated into these distinct variables and given these kinds of descriptions, I'm hearing something more like we have an extremely complicated dynamical system. The mesh maybe is so complex that we can't even fully characterize where the system is in its state space. And then you talk about equilibria, you talk about the system unfolding. All of that sounds like now trajectories through a state space of an extraordinarily complex system that maybe from time to time we just try to isolate little causal relationships between particular variables, but it's not the whole story. So that's what I'm hearing. I mean, does that?
So I like what you just said about we can isolate in some cases discrete relationships between causal variables, but it's not the whole story. I like the feels of thinking about, and I think to some extent, I think the relationship with dynamical systems approaches is a natural connection to draw. I don't know what but two hesitations. One is I don't know. I don't know what I would be taking on board with how you just characterized things that wouldn't be a good fit with where I want to go. Gosh, I lost the second one. I hope this is what I was going to say. And no, maybe I'll just stop. I lost my second part. Sorry.
Perhaps for the first round of questions, then maybe if we're not fully very exhausted, we'll take the follow-up question. So you go ahead. Yeah, you.
Oh, yes. Yeah, pretty hot. I'm relatively here, but let's see what. Yeah, I was just thinking about the causal mesh. I was wondering if there could be an analogy between, say, an ecology, and I'm thinking through the philosophy of ecology just a little bit, and seeing how, I guess, organisms and environment interact with one another. I'm just like thinking,
yeah,
especially drawing on how you have said relations being an interrelation. I take that to be as being how is one causing the other, and that kind of form, I guess, not necessarily how the I guess the background conditions are, but I guess like how they can change and so on, but also jumping a little bit to the point, I guess. Wondering if like maybe investigation of like, relevance and causation could be an analogous to say niche, or kind of look into that. Sorry, I'm not in that. So.
Yeah. Okay. So was your question the last little bit of what you said? If so, I need you to repeat it. So I like the connection that you drew with ecological systems and organism-environment interactions. And I think that that's a place where we see some use for complex systems approaches. And it's a natural place where I think that there's some advantage to thinking about reciprocal causation and kind of the point about causal structure being important and things like that. I don't know if you wanted more than that. Okay, cool. Thank you.
This is a question, but I just kind of curious how the matters and sort of philosophical application. I'm just more wondering, as like part of this project, if you spent any time thinking about whether a change in our understanding of causation like this might have any implications for like social normative practices, or a little bit undesirable. I'm just
Okay.
Yeah, I guess.
Well, I need you to say more because I haven't worried about this. So tell me why I should worry about negative social normative like implications of this.
Someone, something, response.
Good. Yeah. Good. So,
It's a very
no, that what you just said helped me understand kind of the worry. That was helpful. So I would love for this to be influential enough to have social normative implications, and I think they'd be good ones. I was a graduate student. I'll see if I can do this on the fly. I'm not good with specifics, as I said already, and examples. I was a graduate student at Stanford, and the Stanford prison experiments famously happened there. Zimbardo gave a talk while I was a graduate student there, and at that time, he was also testifying at the trials of the prison guards at Abu Ghraib to make the point about the structure in which they're operating as a sort of mitigating cause for their behavior. And I take that to be an instance of recognizing structure and causal complexity in this sense, as kind of causal mesh, or one aspect of what I'm emphasizing is a causal mesh here. And I think that there's a lot of times where causal discourse is important. I mean, medicine is another great example where causal discourse is really important in society. And by and large, I think it presumes a simple view of causal relations that doesn't obtain, and then it invites us to ignore stuff that really matters, especially the structural stuff in many cases.
Thank you very much. I want to understand better what the mesh model is.
Mm-hmm.
The account you've given so far feels a bit like the definition of God.
Okay.
We're supposed to understand God by being told what God isn't, not bounded in space, not bounded in time.
Yeah.
Not limited in capacity, not limited in knowledge.
Perfectly benevolent.
I'm sorry?
Perfectly benevolent. We have positive descriptions of God.
Okay, thank you. I scratched that off my worry list. What the screen is.
The causal mesh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not linear. Sorry, so not non-linear. I mean, what's non-linear? They're variables, and they have non-linear mathematical relations
Yes.
between them.
Yes. If treated as variables, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you said not directed, so that's correlational. Is that the idea?
Wait, for what part? Sorry. Oh, like not two-part? Is that what you're thinking of? Not directional.
Was that, did I get it wrong?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure. I definitely don't want to sort of say merely correlational in some way that causation isn't. Yeah. Can be represented with many. You're never going to be done. Okay. You're. Sorry, I'm trying.
None of them actually apply. Where do I?
So the only thing that I
just give me something solid that I can that has no knots in it, and I can build on that.
Presume something represented as a causal variable influences something else unless shown otherwise. Presume there are interactions and feedback loops and nonlinear relationships unless we find that we're in a special case where there's not.
That's an attitude. That's not a model. You're telling me I should think about things as though they are interacting.
See the world as if the stuff that it says. See the world as if it's full of complex systems with open boundaries, where when we intervene, we shift a mesh of, sorry for using my metaphor, if we shift a suite of regularly interacting, I'll just talk about variables. I was trying to kind of be one step distant from that, but it's getting too hard. When we intervene, assume that we're shifting a mesh of suite of already interacting causal variables rather than introducing change into a system otherwise at stasis. Something like that.
The causal interacting, what's added by that?
That we are appreciating that any causal influence is occurring in a background of additional causal influences. Yes, and that we can't presume, right, that those are kind of a stable background, something like that with the introduced change.
Yeah, I'll we're done with the first round. Do you have energy for 3 more questions for a second round? Yes. I've got 3 people on the list. Yes.
It's okay with me.
Okay, then
It's okay with others.
Maybe you're the first one, second one, and then Clark and Sandy. Maybe.
So I was thinking about this in the context of a mathematized theory acquisition. So lots of systems there that I absolutely think about are complicated, non-isolated. I can think about plasma flow in the accretion disk of a black hole, or structure formation in galaxies. So absolutely these would be systems that fit this kind of framework.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now, if I think about how those systems tend to be modeled physically, what you've ultimately got is a system of interacting differential equations. And you might be trying to solve those numerically or approximate analytically or things of that kind. And none of that itself is causal, of course. That's just, I mean, you don't need to use the causal.
Right.
The way, as a physicist, the way I think about causal stories in that framework is that this is a very complicated system. And one of the useful ways we might want to study the information out is through kind of interventionist style. Eternal gravitational field of black hole, what happens? How does this thing co-vary with that thing when I keep other things fixed? Those are things I might be studying empirically, but at least at the modeling level. I'll be studying by numerical or analytic studying of the equation system. So, and I distinguish that kind of mathematized theory from a special science framework where it might be less quantitatively modeled and where it might be using Cordy fork as one baseline way of talking about the interaction structure.
Okay.
So the question is, if I've got a system of that kind, there are sort of narrow interventionist notions of causation that are quite useful ways of getting information. And then there's the full-on study of the dynamical equations. Now, is there a kind of place in that story for your causal mesh talk? Separate from either of those kind of ways of studying the system? Or is the causal mesh talk translated into a mathematical theory like that really just another way of talking about studying the system of dynamical equations?
I think, thanks for the question. I think, so this should not be seen as an alternative, as the recommendation of alternative mode of study compared to the 2 alternatives that you sketched. Yeah, so what do I say about what it is? What was your second option that you gave me? That might help me.
I mean, and by the way, this wasn't really critical.
Sure.
Well, one way I might make sense of your story is that the sort of mathematized physics version of the causal mesh is studying those aspects of the system where just that kind of intervention route isn't exhaustive as a way of understanding the structure of the system. And so what Boswell was offering was that in some ways the causal mesh story translated into mathematized physics might simply be a way of talking about studying various features and properties of the system of equations that aren't well captured in a kind of direct causation talk.
Yes, I think so. And sort of, stomping and or fist pounding and suggesting that we are generally faced with systems that, if we had the time and inclination, would permit this kind of complex system analysis, something like that. Thanks. Oh no.
Patience is mother of virtue.
So I challenge your garden story now. I want to challenge your sociology.
Okay.
You made several times claims about inferences scientists make. In particular, that they don't recognize that their effects are due to multiple causes, or that they are conditional on various stability conditions, or that they recognize they're dealing with very complex systems. My experience is exactly the opposite. They do. And it's important in choosing research projects. And it's important in your conception of what kind of research is worth doing. So take the most ordinary regression model, take the most ordinary experimental result, there are always residuals. The correlations obtained are either large or small. The variance accounted for is either large or small. Depending on that, the alternative causes, which are always recognized, are important to research or not. So I think it's just ubiquitous that two things. One thing that's ubiquitous is that scientists don't like talking about cause. But that aside, if you could get them to, they would acknowledge, indeed think it's fundamental to their strategic procedures to think about alternative causes, further causes, more causes, stability of their system. And furthermore, we actually have an example of the scientific mesh, and that's the brain. By the late 19th century, it was recognized exactly as one of your meshes. And depending on attitudes towards that mesh, you got different scientific strategies. Behaviorism was almost exclusively a response to the mesh model. The result is, okay, it's a mesh, there's no individual causal structure. Let's look at input and output relations. The other response was, let's take it apart. Let's see if we can find subsystems which act together collectively, which we can identify as variables, call them parts. They might be spatially coherent, they might be distributed, etc. And we know which proved the more fruitful line of research in the long run. It was the latter. So, but I think the recognition that when you do an experiment, there's lots of other stuff going on, is ubiquitous. So obviously scientists don't talk philosophical terminology, they don't talk about the mesh, but if you could put it to them intelligibly so they would recognize the language, I think they mostly agree.
So I agree with what you say about that, the particular way in which scientists working in that kind of a research framework not only accept, but it's sort of important methodologically to note the possibility, the likelihood of other causal influences. I do think, though, first of all, I think that scientists are various. And so I think some scientists are less prey to the sort of billiard ball commitment that I'm trying to motivate here than others. So scientists vary. But then I do think that for at least for some scientists, a commitment to something like what I'm trying to motivate in opposition to the view I'm trying to develop here comes out in other ways. And so, for example, I mentioned also at lunch with graduate students that what motivated my dissertation research originally was meeting and talking with two biologists in the Stanford biology department, one of whom showed me how population genetics, his subfield, is all you have to do evolutionary biology, and the other of which showed me all you have to do is evolutionary ecology, and you don't need population genetics. And this kind of, maybe not the best example, but this kind of anticipation that we're after the account for what's occurring is, I think, really common. And I think that's one place among many where this kind of an expectation comes up. I also think, as I suggested late in my talk, there's a way in which, at least in some fields, and I think it's pretty common, complex systems approaches, I'm generically referring to them, are treated as, by those who don't practice them, as kind of less than fully enlightening, that also anticipates that there's kind of a basicness to interventionist style causal analysis that is lacking from approaches that characterize sort of system-wide dynamics. Couple of places.
Example of complex system research with results that you think are important?
I think some of the dynamical systems stuff in cognition is cool and enlightening. That's as much as I can give you with my brain, with my blood sugar level where it is right now. Ecology. Ecology I'm probably more comfortable with. Yes.
Not cognition.
Oh, sorry. I jumped in with ecology because I jumped in with ecology afterwards, realizing that I'm more competent to talk about ecology than cognitive science. But both of those places, for example.
Mine's a kind of complementary claim about not that scientists haven't noticed this, but philosophers haven't noticed this. And so I guess what I get a little nervous when you talk about a new fundamental notion of causation.
For sure. I do too.
Know what that is. And it does, and you've not told us really what it is or how we would establish what the fundamental view of causation is. So just to give us a little bit of the philosophy, I mean, John Stuart Mill's thought that causation was all of the events and circumstances that jointly prior to an effect to bring it about. And I don't think any, I mean, for all extensive, intensive purposes, that seems to me agreeable to either the mesh or to the billiard.
Yeah.
Then the question is, okay, well, in the limit, that's the history of the universe, is the cause of Clark putting that cigar in his mouth just now.
There's so many causes. This is a complex system.
In any case, that's in the limit, but that as if, and we might all agree to that, but it's kind of beside the point, since and having that view about causation, that everything in the history of the universe is the cause of any effect that we pick out now, though true, gives us no useful information whatsoever. And so what is the role of identifying causes as either billiard balls or a mesh do for us? I mean, in addition, of course, Mill thought that most causes were compositional and not singular. I mean, it's not for nothing that actually Mill started this project by wanting to understand the social world and thought he had to figure out the logic of the natural accounts of causation to do it. But this view that that philosophers don't talk about complex causality, I think is also not descriptively accurate. The question is, what is it that we use this notion of causality to do, and how do we model it in order to achieve the goals that we want the notion of causality to perform? And so I'm not quite sure, when you just say we want it to be fundamentally correct, I don't even know what you do to do that. But if we want causality to give us some indications of how to proceed in the world, right? Then it strikes me that compositional causes of either these features or the features of billiard balls is what philosophers have always talked about. And so I'm not quite sure that there's a new fundamental reason, it seems to me you are correct. I agree with you in my understanding work on complex science has indicated this, that there are multiple ways in which there are multiple factors that may not have been represented or acknowledged that may play a big role, right? And in producing a particular effect. And sometimes it's the structure and not the properties of individual components of that structure that are the most important for certain kinds of effects. And sometimes it's the components and not the structure that's responsible for other kinds of effects. And so it strikes me that that is true of what we choose to, what we can pick out and search for and understand, that we should be expansive in the kinds of things to consider. But what are the criteria? And this was in answer, trying to get at the, how do we know when it's not a cause, right? I mean, if you're going to use the notion of cause, this kind of how you rule out things that are merely correlations or ephemeral or something, that you need some kind of criteria of what it is that we use the language of cause to pick out, so it functions to do what we want it to do. And I'm not quite sure how the mesh introduces a new set of criteria. So that's
okay.
the question is, how do we?
That was a lot.
Well, how do you think about it as meshes make a difference?
How does it make a difference at all? Okay. I heard
that?
other things there, so I'm going to start with that because I think it'll be most useful. So I think I probably said fundamentally, because anyway, like at root in some, anyway, I'm not going to try to explain how I got there. I don't mean, in case this is part of what you were reacting to, that the aspects of causation that I am claiming and trying to emphasize in this talk is like, what's most important to characterizing causation as a relation or anything like that. Like I tried to kind of work through, very briefly, physical and manipulability approaches to causation to kind of gesture at ways in which I thought that this might actually have implications for those philosophical debates, or sort of relate in those philosophical contexts, and also to acknowledge that there are questions about how we can best analyze the causal relation that I'm not even touching in this talk. I also don't want to say, and this is probably something I could do a better job of being clear about in the talk, that every philosopher and scientist always have rejected, what I'm trying to motivate as this causal mesh view. I think that there are lots of important inspirations, both among philosophers and among scientists, pushing in this direction. I tried to motivate, and I do still think that in some common philosophy of science discourse about causation, and in how physical and manipulability accounts or approaches to causation proceed, there's a kind of expectation of a building up from fundamental causal relations that I think it is productive philosophically and scientifically to push against and consider reframing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think that we all on the 11th floor where we have a reception for. 1 hour 15 minutes.
What's that?
1 hour 15 minutes of Q&A. You must be actually quite tired.
It was okay.
We have some sugar out there that you can actually refurbish your body. So.
Good. Thank you, Edward, for
No,
all
thanks.
of
There was
that.
a lively discussion on
Hi.
Thank you.